I want to thank everyone in attendance, particularly Dr. Robin Eli for extending the invitation, and I also want to take a minute and thank the staff for arranging things. Today I'm going to be talking about my work on race and organization, parts of which I'm currently expanding into a book, so if you have suggestions for what you want to hear more about, please let me know. So the idea for this paper came about as I was working on my dissertation on race and gender in the military. I was introduced to Joan Acker's foundational work on gendered organizations, and it helped me to explain some of the gendered relations I saw in my data. I recognized that sociological race scholarship hadn't adequately theorized how organizations are structured by race and racism. In the dissertation, I extended Acker's work through analogy to explain persistent disparities in military discipline or the clustering of people of color at the bottom of military hierarchy. I thought that some of the processes I saw in the military were likely generalizable to other organizations, but I had to finish the dissertation. So when I finished, this was the first paper I wrote. Acker's work pointed to the need for such a theory, and she concludes with what I think were some tantalizing questions for race scholars. She asks, is the abstract worker white as well as male? Are white male-dominated organizations also built upon assumptions about the proper place of people with different color skins? And are racial differences produced by organizational practices as gender differences are? My theory of racialized organizations attempts to answer Acker's questions by arguing that organizations aren't race neutral. Race scholars have largely neglected the role of organizations in the social construction of race, and scholars of organizations typically see race as a demographic characteristic rather than constitutive of organizations. So the goal of my paper, or my theory, was to bridge the subfields through critique and analysis, through critique and synthesis, excuse me. In the full paper, to do this, I briefly engaged the literature on race and organizations to argue that each body of literature misses key insights that would ultimately strengthen the theoretical development across the subfields. I argue that organizations reproduce and sometimes challenge racialization processes, as racial schemas provide a template for organizational action. Here, I want to define racialized organizations and quickly foreshadow the tenets that flow from my definition so you know where we're going. Racialized organizations are meso-level social structures limiting the personal agency and collective efficacy of subordinate racial groups while magnifying the agency of dominant groups. Following this definition, I argue that racialized organizations enhance or diminish the agency of racial groups, that racialized organizations legitimate the unequal distribution of resources, whiteness often serves as an organizational credential, and that organizational rules are often decoupled in practice. Each of these tenets highlights the connection of racial schemas to a particular set of material and social resources. And I think seeing organizations as racial structures provides a descriptively more realistic picture of organizational formation, hierarchy, and processes. I also want to emphasize that race is a multidimensional, hierarchical, socio-political construct. Paraphrasing Marx, I define race not as a thing, but as a social relationship between persons mediated through things. This definition of race highlights that race is constructed relationally through the distribution of social, psychological, and material resources. Racism, or the racial ideology of a racialized social system, is a post hoc rationalization of racial inequality. Drawing on Sewell's theory of social structures, I argue that seeing organizations as a type of racial structure can link the subfields. For Sewell, social structures are dual in that they are simultaneous expressions of cultural schemas and material resources. Schemas are generalizable, often unconscious, cognitive default assumptions that act as situationally applicable templates for social action. Schemas can be thought of as a kind of unwritten rule book explaining how to write organizational rules. And these schemas provide a set of fundamental tools of thought for the accumulation and distribution of organizational resources. Sewell defines resources broadly, including not just material resources, but, quote, any media of power used to gain, enhance, contest, or maintain social position. So resources include objects philosophical materialists consider resources such as physical capital, raw material, and commodities, and also more intangible human resources such as physical strength, dexterity, or knowledge, and the explicit rules of social interaction. Both material and social resources are often expressed according to an underlying schematic map. and organizations are central to accumulating, managing, monopolizing, and apportioning the resources that make up social structures. When schemas are connected to resources, they become social structures. Race, as a multidimensional concept, encodes schemas of sub- and superordination that can be activated when they're connected to resources. We could think of the Baroque racial etiquette under Jim Crow, which reinforced hierarchical relations among individuals and racial groups, as an example of a schema of racial subordination expressed through the rules of social interaction. For instance, segregation is a schema that limits or grants access to material and social resources. Under Jim Crow, the schema of segregation was manifest in the expectation that Black people work in menial jobs, attend segregated schools, or sit apart on public transportation. It's no accident that many of the civil rights movement's most iconic actions, the Memphis sanitation strike, the Freedom Rides and Montgomery bus boycott, and the lunch counter sit-ins, involved activists' clever manipulation of these racialized organizational resources. In each of these cases, the schema of racial segregation was expressed through an organizational resource, for instance, buses, lunch counters, or wages, that was subsequently legitimated by the laws of the racial state. Thus, we should think of segregation not as an unchanging thing, but segregation as a social relationship with a variable impact relative to the resources it marshals. Once racial structures are in place, a racial ideology or racism arises to justify the unequal distribution of resources. Racial ideologies then reinforce the underlying cognitive schema. Racist ideologies are explicit defenses of the racial structure that endows actors with differential forms of agency. Because racial schemas are easily applied to new organizational resources, racial ideologies can be re-articulated in novel historical conditions as racist ideas adapt to changing power relations. Ideological claims about racial inequality, i.e. biological or cultural racism, are always expressed in relation to the distribution of resources. Further, as the line from racial ideology to racial schemas in this figure shows, these justifications can reinforce the underlying racial schema. This view of racial ideology is mediated through resources, breaks with literature that conceptualizes racism as existing independently of underlying material or social conditions. Simply put, individual prejudice unconnected to active discrimination that hoards resources does little harm. As Sewell claims, schemas not empowered or regenerated by resources would eventually be abandoned and forgotten. The model I outlined sees racial structures as existing at multiple social levels. Just as the structure of capitalism is expressed in both the commerce of a child's lemonade stand and the massive resources of a multinational corporation, racial structures are produced through individual, organizational, and state-level actions. Racial structures exist when schemas are connected to resources in ways that differentially advantage racial groups at any social level. Racial structures are institutionalized when they are replicated across many organizational forms. Adopting this model of racial structure helps to explain mechanisms reproducing racial inequality in the absence of conscious discriminatory intent. Arguing that schemas are basically a type of habit, Neil Gross claims that social mechanisms are aggregations of actors, problem situations, and habitual responses, allowing for the machine-like or nearly automatic reproduction of social relations. When people act creatively in the face of new problems, they may generate novel mechanisms. But this creativity isn't entirely random. It's often constrained by habitually enacted schemas, which are transposable or easily applied to new circumstances. To illustrate how schemas connected to resources in novel ways can generate new mechanisms of racial inequality, it's helpful to recall how the schema of segregation was reapplied following the landmark Supreme Court decision outlining state-sponsored segregation in Brown v. Board. Legalized school segregation coupled the racial schema of segregation with school resources to create meso-level structures that entrenched racial inequality. Following Brown, segregation didn't disappear. Rather, the schema was expressed through organizational resources in new ways, such as tracking programs that internally segregated students and the development of quote-unquote segregation academies as white parents enrolled their children in private schools. That is, organizational forms shifted as underlying schemas of racial inclusion were paired with emergent organizational resources. Segregation through exclusion was replaced by segregation through unequal incorporation. School organizations, depending on how they deployed resources in relation to racial schemas, supported, undermined, or caused innovations in the wider racialized social system. Racialized schematic maps allow for the development of novel mechanisms of racial control as schemas and resources are combined in new ways. So in the remainder of the talk, I'm just going to lay out the 4 tenets of racialized organizations that flow from this definition. Each of these tenets, the unequal distribution of resources and the credentialing of whiteness, differentially endows agency along racial lines. The relationship between structure and agency is one of sociology's most fundamental questions. Sewell claims the extent of agency exercised by individual persons depends profoundly upon their position in collective organizations, because those at the top of organizational hierarchies can, quote, bind the collectivity with their actions. Further, the symbolic meanings conferred by segregated organizational hierarchies influence interactions outside of formal organizations. One way racialized organizations shape agency is by controlling time use. One's location within a racialized organization influences the amount of control one exercises over their time, the ability to plan non-work time, and the ability to plot the future. Within organizations, segregation or incorporation into the lower tiers diminishes one's ability to influence organizational procedures and the larger institutional environment. Segregated schools make it harder for non-white children to actualize their futures. How racialized subordinates spend their time at work, in school, or at church is typically delineated by organizational procedures. For instance, non-whites are overrepresented in precarious jobs with highly variable schedules that make it difficult to manage family obligations and plan the use of their non-work time. Organizations also shape agency by what amounts to the theft of time from non-whites. By this, I mean that organizations differentially apportion time along racial lines to redistribute time from non-whites to whites. Quati, focusing on the healthcare system, argues that racial differences in life expectancy are partially produced by healthcare organizations that literally steal time from black people. But Quati's central point on the racialized apportioning of time could be generalized to organizations more broadly. Organizations racialize time by shaping future opportunities and orientations. Organizations also legitimate the unequal distribution of resources. Segregation is designed to limit access to resources. And racial segregation is a defining feature of most organizations that was historically enforced through custom, policy, and law. At the institutional level, segregation typically means that organizations with large proportions of people of color are under-resourced relative to white organizations. Earlier scholars, such as Fraser and Maribel, point to the results of this division of organizational resources. Discussing black capitalism, Fraser claimed the total assets of all Negro banks in the United States were less than those of a single small white bank in New York. Similarly, Maribel argues that the combined assets of all black-owned businesses could be purchased by a single large oil company. This highly unequal distribution of resources continues through segregated businesses that channel money to white business owners. Black people regularly shop in white-owned stores. Often there's no other option. But segregation ensures whites rarely shop in black businesses and are unlikely to work for black bosses. Institutionalized racial exclusion from organizations has deeply shaped the competitive environment, disadvantaging non-white organizations. Integrated organizations internally replicate this segregation, as racial hierarchies are mapped onto ostensibly non-racial positions. For instance, through job sorting, positions in the labor hierarchy become associated with racial groups and accordingly devalued or overvalued. Or we can think of academic tracking, which stigmatizes black students by associating blackness with lower academic achievement. Whiteness is a credential that provides access to organizational resources, legitimizes work hierarchies, and expands white agency. This credential helps organizations appear facially neutral in principle, while in practice institutionalizing the property interest in whiteness. Credentials are allegedly objective, organizationally generated statuses showing suitability for employment. According to this narrative, credentials replace described statuses as legitimate bureaucratic means of allocating resources. Field experiments have generated some of the most important empirical evidence on the credential of whiteness, showing that hiring discrimination should be considered a general organizational process. When discrimination is examined through audit methodology, which isolates racial meanings as causes of differential treatment, racialized exclusion exists across economic sectors and despite matched formal credentials. Regardless of legal restrictions on racial discrimination, many employers are still against hiring people of color due to schemas related to allegedly poor work ethic and attitudes. Yet, research continue to conceptualize credentials as race neutral. When describing the effect of racial identity on credentials, scholars operationalize discrimination as differential returns to the same credential. But the problem with interpreting this as differential return to the same credential is that typically perceived racial identity trumps the credential. For instance, Pager discusses the, quote, negative credential of a criminal record, and her research compellingly shows that incarceration influenced subsequent employment opportunities. Conceptualizing a criminal record as a negative credential illustrates the long-term consequences of incomplete organizational incorporation. However, her findings show that blackness is another negative credential, as black men without criminal records were less likely to be called back for a job interview than formerly incarcerated whites. Organizational racialization is thus a credentialing process. Typically, former credentials are considered neutral because they're bureaucratically conferred, while ascribed categories are not highly formalized and are socially illegitimate. However, constructionist accounts of race claim that race is produced through precisely such bureaucratic processes. For instance, the one-drop rule assigning race at birth was institutionally formalized through state laws, but applied unevenly through local-level organizations. Seeing racialization as a relational credentialing process resonates with Harris's classic conceptualization of whiteness as a form of property. Racialized organizations often decouple formal commitments to equity, access, and inclusion from policies and practices that reinforce or at least don't challenge existing racial hierarchies. Objective rules and practices may be enforced in ways that disadvantage non-whites, or rules aimed at diversifying or ending discrimination may be ignored. This decoupling allows organizations to maintain legitimacy and appear neutral or even progressive while doing little to intervene in pervasive patterns of racial inequality. Organizational rules designed to protect minority classes from discrimination are routinely broken, and racialized organizations are likely to apply rules differentially based upon the race of the rule breaker. Neo-institutionalists have long argued that former organizational rules are often decoupled in practice, and that this decoupling may occur when there's a contradiction between organizational efficiency and policies adopted to placate external constituencies. Yet many descriptions of bureaucratic rule-breaking leave out the importance of rules and hierarchy in shaping who is allowed to break the rules. In many cases, organizations adopted affirmative action, diversity, and anti-discrimination policies out of fear of government sanctions, or more recently, in response to protests, but they retroactively claimed benevolent intent. Diversity policies often serve a kind of ceremonial public relations function, but have done very little overall to change the racial distribution of organizational power, as most diversity policies lack the formal enforcement measures that, for a short historical moment, made affirmative action effective. Whether this is through lack of commitment or design is an empirical question. However, there is a, quote, assumed white center in most diversity discourse, with organizations expecting minorities to conform to established white norms and standards. After all that, in the full paper, I discuss external and internal sources of shifts in the way that organizations use race, and I talk about social movements, interstate conflicts, and attempts to gain market share. I'm happy to talk about any of these or really anything else in the Q&A.